What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. This Friday, Netflix is releasing a new entry in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, which gave me the itch to make a video about Toby Hooper's classic film. For my money, the original movie is a strong contender for the best horror film ever made, an 83-minute masterpiece that has rarely, if ever, been equaled in the horror genre. Of course, movies like Night of the Living Dead, Rosemary's Baby, and The Exorcist are all part of that conversation, but of all these movies, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the only one of them that still really gets under my skin, both disturbing and intriguing me in a way that I find to be irresistible. The 70s gave us so many savage, groundbreaking movies like Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs and Ken Russell's The Devils, but I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is right up there with any of them as one of the key films in my favorite decade of filmmaking. But before I go any further, I should mention that Hooper's film has a slightly different name from the rest of the movies in the franchise, with the word chainsaw broken into two words, sometimes but not always in the various posters. But I say this just so it won't be confused with the remake from 2003, which included the in the title, but smushed chainsaw back into one word, while the 2022 movie is just called Texas Chainsaw Massacre without the. But I have to admit, I'm not that fired up about seeing any movie in this franchise not directed by Tobe Hooper. I'm a big fan of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, but admittedly, it's a very different film from the first one, kind of like what Sam Raimi did with Evil Dead 2 versus the first Evil Dead. And of course, any popular horror franchise is going to have remakes and sequels until the end of time, squeezing the original idea completely dry of every last juicy detail, and I have the wisdom to accept that. However, I would much prefer to see young filmmakers go out and make something brand new that's just as fucked up and brilliant as the original movie. I want to see young filmmakers embrace the spirit of Tobe Hooper and his collaborators and the absolute hell they went through making this first film. A few 27-hour shooting days in 120-degree heat surrounded by stinking rotten meat will help any young crew earn their stripes, no matter what the name of the movie might be. And speaking of names, there's never been a better name for a horror movie than the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When we hear people put those words together, we should feel like we're about to watch a movie that's going to murder us, rip our fucking heads right off our shoulders. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it should never be a cute slasher movie about hot teens getting picked off one at a time. I don't even consider the first movie to be a slasher movie. It's way too good to be reduced to that subgenre, even if it's a subgenre that I love, but let's all be honest, slasher movies can be a little formulaic. Hooper's film is just so much deeper than that, taking our imaginations to the darkest depths that horror films have ever explored. And let me give you an example. When the character Jerry comes looking for his friends, he hears something thumping around in a freezer, he opens it up, whereupon Pam, who's been in there for hours, suddenly thrashes to life, delivering one of the biggest jump scares in movie history. But the jump scare's not what gets me. What really unnerves me is how quickly and casually Leatherface slams the freezer shut again, and for the briefest of moments we felt like Pam might have had a chance to live, but no, at this point she's just meat, and that's all she's ever going to be. And what this moment vividly reminds me of are the few times where I've gone deep sea fishing, and where any fish you don't throw back, you end up throwing in a cooler where they continue to thrash and bump around long after you think they should have expired. But of course we don't care because those fish, they're just meat. We're going to be eating them shortly. And this scene with Pam horrifies me to the core of my soul because it's the only time I've seen human beings depicted in such a fashion so convincingly. And I've seen a lot of the great cannibal movies out there, but none of them has a scene that upsets me this deeply like that one. It's probably the one scene in any movie I've ever seen which makes me second guess the fact that I even eat meat at all. So that's what I'm talking about when I say this movie transcends the slasher genre. This movie affects the viewer on a subconscious emotional level that most slasher films could never dream of. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is probably the best movie we're ever going to see about city dwellers' fear of those who live out in the boonies. Some might make a case for Deliverance, another movie that I love, but this one feels much more personal, a movie about Texas made by Texans. Tobe Hooper was from Austin, and he admitted in his brilliant commentary track on the Blu-ray, which I have right here, that he was absolutely terrified of a lot of rural Texans, in particular his own family members, many of whom suffered from alcoholism, madness, and just all around deeply dysfunctional behavior. Which leads us to the first family of the horror genre. One of the main reasons that I push back on the idea that this is a slasher movie, most slasher franchises have one bad guy who keeps coming back over and over. But Leatherface is arguably the least disturbing individual in his adorably fucked up family. If anything, he's kind of pitiful as he has this absolute panic attack over all these intruders that keep coming into his secluded little world. But the hitchhiker played by Edwin Neal and the old man played by Jim Seidel, I'm not quite sure how his last name is pronounced, I've never said it out loud before, but these two actors' performances are far more unsettling in my eyes. The hitchhiker's arguments for sticking with the old ways of using a sledge to kill cattle always sucks me right into this deranged world.
No way. With a sledge. See, that was better. They died better that way.
But my favorite piece of acting in the entire movie is when the kids first pull up to the gas station with this sign that proudly proclaims, "We slaughter barbecue." But this old man comes out and starts talking to them and tries to a degree to encourage the kids to stick around, eat some barbecue, and just wait for the gas truck, which should be arriving sometime later that day. But what makes me so uneasy is seeing how he's barely able to hold it together. You can see that there's this madness lurking just underneath the surface, but he's more or less able to function in the outside world for brief periods of time. But then later in the movie, as he lets his guard down, it's fascinating watching him rapidly switching gears between all these warring impulses and emotions, sometimes berating his family for tearing up the place and ripping up doors, but then a few minutes later getting emotionally wounded and indignant when he's described as just a cook. And these family squabbles are just so fascinating for me because they hint at so much history and so much violent and disturbing behavior that goes back generations. But as brilliant as these performances might be, what makes this movie work is the style. Hooper's style is nothing short of awe-inspiring. I've never seen a director in the horror genre who's been able to generate such a feeling of unease with just a simple long shot in the sun without any musical accompaniment of any kind. But Hooper does it over and over again with this movie, oftentimes delivering some of the most beautiful shots in the history of the horror genre. And of course, these moments of the calm before the storm, when we get exposed to iconic scenes like Leatherface scooping up Pam as easily as he would a child and dragging her back inside, or the extreme close-ups of Marilyn Burns' eyes when she's having her epic freak-out toward the end of the movie, those shots genuinely make me feel like I'm going insane as I watch them. And we have this decision to end the movie on such an enigmatic, mysterious beat with Leatherface dancing in the dawn's early light with his chainsaw, all while we hear the insane laughter of a woman who just might be broken inside for all the time. This is one of the best endings to any movie that I've ever seen, irrespective of the genre. And it all adds up to just a genuinely traumatizing experience. And I think one of the best examples of this movie's undeniable power is how British censors couldn't point to any one scene or shot that they found to be objectionable. However, they just knew that there was something about the film that was all around unhealthy for the viewers to experience. Consequently, the movie was banned in the UK for 20 years, a badge of honor as far as I'm concerned. Now, before I wrap up, I want to close with a few words by filmmaker Christopher Funderburg. A few years ago, I participated in a roundtable conversation about Toby Hooper's career with Marcus Penn, Kevin Marr, and the fellows who run The Pink Smoke, John Cribbs and Christopher Funderburg. And we all picked a movie by Toby Hooper to rant and rave about. I chose Life Force, but Funderburg proceeded to offer up the best review of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that I expect I will ever hear from anyone. So now I'd like to play for you some of the audio from Wrong Reel 247, and I'll include links to that podcast as well as Funderburg and The Pink Smoke in the description below.
For a long time, if you asked me what the greatest movie ever made was, I would have said The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I've become less like, that's a question that's irrelevant in meaning, so I don't answer that way anymore. But I think if you're honestly talking about movies and you have a canon of about 20 films and Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not in it, you are not someone who is seriously thinking about cinema. It means either that you don't take the horror genre seriously, which is which means you're not taking cinema seriously if you don't take horror cinema seriously, or you've got some preconceived notion of what it is and what place it occupies. It is an unbelievably well-made movie to me. And I think it's also hard to quantify film. It gets called like the grandfather of the slasher films in its structure and meaning and sort of pursuits as a movie. It is not a slasher film. The second half of the movie, it's got a very basic two-half structure. You have these sort of anonymous characters that are hard to describe in any meaningful terms, who seem like your main characters, who are the victims of the family. I'm assuming everybody knows the basic plot. There's a family that's going to their grandfather's house. They end up stumbling upon a murderous clan of inbred, we don't know that for certain, but backwoods types. And the second half of the movie is all about this family, though. It becomes like a weird family dynamic film. That's got the dinner table scene, that's the big centerpiece scene of the movie, but it's three brothers, although their relationships aren't clearly delineated in the film. A lot of what's interesting about the film is how relationships between characters and things aren't carefully delineated in it, and a character they call Grandpa, which is sort of like this living corpse creature. You're led to believe he's a corpse for a lot of the movie, then he comes alive at the taste of blood, basically. And just these family dynamics between it. And that's a very strange thing. My favorite moment in the movie is early on, people keep stumbling upon this house, and there's Leatherface, who keeps finding them and killing them. But there's this thing that happens where he's like a big hulking baddie in like a skin suit, and so he's a typical villain in some ways, but the movie takes this very strange moment to signal it's going to have a shift in perspective, where when he kills the second person, he runs out and looks out his front window and is looking around and sit downs and sort of puts his head in his hands in this moment that reads like, what the fuck is going on here? Where are these people coming from? Like, what is going on in my world? And he's not a malevolent force. It's this weirdly like poetic person who is so deep in their own philosophy and existence and familial structures, whatever those are, that they literally can't conceive of the world outside of themselves. And they're terrified by it, and they have a sort of violent reaction to it. This is a movie if you can't tell, I've done like college lectures on several times for like nerdy linguistics and semiotics type stuff with it. I always talk about this movie as, to put it in the most pretentious terms possible, it's very pure Artaud theater of cruelty, right? Artaud. And the idea with theater of cruelty isn't that this is like a mean movie. He was really into the surrealists and Dadaists and that sort of thing. And what you do is you create an artwork that's transgressive, that moves the audience outside of the normal moral, philosophical, ethical, aesthetic boundaries that they're used to. Not to show them your philosophy, not to convince them of anything, but to make them reconsider. That's it. You move them out and you make them reconsider the boundaries that they've been existing within. And I think that's what's funny is Ebert has a famously like clueless review of this movie. That's like, I forget what the exact wording is, but of no apparent purpose unless to shock and disgust are purposes. And it's like, well, yes, that actually is the purpose. It's the exact same purpose as something like Un Chien Andalou that resists coherent interpretation. The idea is that this movie, if this movie is a movie that has been called a lot of opposing things. It gets called a scary movie and a comedy. It gets called a tract for vegetarianism. It gets called a countercultural movie. It gets called an expression of conservatism. It gets called a feminist movie. It gets called an anti-feminist movie, right? And the reason is that it's like a great surrealist work trying in its artistic intentions to resist those sort of definitions. Buñuel loves this phrase. He says, with my movies, you should come to the unpronounceable word, right? And I think that what Texas Chainsaw Massacre is being, it's trying to use cinema to reach the unpronounceable word, right? And I think that's something I really love about it. There's three things the final thing that I want to mention that'll come up throughout this. I think with Toby Hooper, who I will call Tobe at some point because it takes so hard to pronounce it correctly, traditional approach to good and bad sort of goes out with the window with this guy. There's a quote from Chronicles of Narnia that Kevin always mentions in his shows or frequently mentions, which is that, don't you know in Narnia things can be both good and bad at the same time? Am I getting the quote right?
It's that sometimes children who have never been to Narnia are not aware that something can be good and terrible at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what this is, but I think that he has a lot of movies that the interest of them defies falling into good or bad categorization. There's a lot of movies that people of his will insist are pure genius, and other people will insist are terrible, like utterly valueless, like as bad a piece of garbage as they're in. Like it won't even occur to them that somebody might think this is the good movie. You know, it's not a matter of opinion. There's like those aesthetic categories get all jumbled up with him. And I think that there's, with Hooper, there's sort of a funny thing that happens where the other important thing about him, because his movies defy these categorizations, he's somebody who throughout his career, you will see his entire career, Everybody, audiences, his collaborators, people who work for him, are constantly trying to take away his artistic agency. It starts on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where midway through filming, the producer of the movie, who's only making it because he has a crush on Marilyn A. Burns, right? The company that produced it is called MAB Films, Marilyn A. Burns Films, right? And she's like a little Texas cutie, and he's like a local politician who's trying to get Texas films made, right? He comes to set and he's like, what the fuck is going on here? This guy doesn't know what he's doing. We got to get him off the film. Everybody famously who worked on this movie hated the experience, hates each other, hates Tobe Hooper. You cannot find a movie where there is more vitriol spewed in every direction about people, and people are constantly like, Toby didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know what he was doing. It was chaos. It was 120 degrees in the suit. I smelled like filth. Gunnar Hansen, who in real life is like the sweetest, he's like an Icelandic poet and like travel writer, you know, like these people are also all like Texas beatniks, which is like a very specific type of weird, you know, sort of Texas countercultural where Toby Hooper will be like, I was a hippie, but I wasn't a hippie. It's hard to explain what I was. And I always think of him as like, there's a certain type of Southern weird, which I'm sure you know, that like, it's like the beatnik weird. It's like a Texas beatnik. But there's one person on Texas Chainsaw Massacre who was like, no, he knew what he was doing. He was completely in control. Everybody else was confused, but I worked with him the closest. And I was constantly impressed by him. And that's Ron Bozeman, who was the production manager, who went on, the only person associated at the film other than Tobe Hooper to have a career. He won an Academy Award as the producer of Silence of the Lambs and has worked with Jonathan Demme. And Bozeman says, no, this guy was absolutely in control and knows what he's doing. I understand why people thought that he wasn't. I'm paraphrasing all this, obviously, but he really was. And I think there's something very fascinating about Texas Chainsaw Massacre in that its admirers, the people who are like, this is a great work of cinema, are like Steven Spielberg and William Friedkin and Jonathan Demme, who have all had growing effusive praise to say about it, in which I, as somebody who's a filmmaker, think when I watch it, a movie that good cannot be made by accident. A movie that good cannot be made by someone who doesn't know what they're doing. It is impossible. And if you're Steven Spielberg and you see that movie, when those type of movies are being made by people who don't know what they're doing, they come out as, you know, Herschel Gordon Lewis. You know, they're the Corpse Grinders or what's the Deadly Game, the Colleen Camp. And you know what I mean? There's movies where people don't know what they're doing and they don't end up looking like that. And sort of that's my final thought on it to say is that I think this is a movie that in terms of how it's edited is unreal and how it uses images, it resembles Un Chien Andalou. You know, the image in Chien Andalou of two dead donkeys on pianos being dragged. You can see that fitting into Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Its editing owes a lot to like the close-ups of eyeballs, another Un Chien Andalou take. But like Stan Brakhage, it has an impressionistic editing, especially as it moves deeper into the psychology of the family in the second half and the dynamic of the family in the second half. And it's marvelous. I think that, you know, Godard is probably the greatest editor who ever lived. I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the greatest edited film there ever was. And even just figuring out impressionistic ways to end it on, to end it on the chainsaw dance, to end it without final girl and without resolution. You know, the ways that the artistic choices this movie makes are so striking that even now they're powerful. It's a movie that's completely shocking even now, you know, and like nothing else. Decades of imitators and nothing else like it. Anyway, that's what I have to say about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And, you know.
I think that deserves at least some applause before we move on. That was incredible. That was awesome. So I hope you enjoyed this little flashback review. Fingers crossed this new movie will encourage a new generation of horror fans to go back and discover the original film. But if you enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified about future content. But I can't thank you enough for listening. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.